Well, let's start with just the story about the bear is really interesting. In the mid 1970s, the circus came to town, and it was held at Assembly Hall. And somewhere along the way, a Kodiak bear escaped its pen and started wandering the hallways of Assembly Hall, and people would stick their head out of their offices, and there would be a Kodiak bear rearing up. And it took a little while to get the bear back under control, but it did make a little interesting morning for somebody coming out 8:30 in the morning, just had their coffee, and there's a bear waiting for them. Well, interestingly, in the 1990s, the roof needed a lot of repair because of it's an ongoing problem of leaks. That was an issue with the roof, and the issue with the leaks was impacted by the fact that some students had found their way onto the roof of Assembly Hall and found it to be a great place to go skateboarding. And so it kind of tore up the roof a little bit with them running their skateboards over what is essentially this rubber membrane that's designed to stop leaks. They're running skateboards over it, and so not only did they have to get chased out, but it took a while to just repair the leaks. Apparently, sometime during the 1970s, people found in the upper reaches of one of the stairwells some wrappers, a mattress, and some evidence that somebody had been living in the stairwell. They never found the person who was living in the stairwell, but there was definitely a lot of evidence that somebody had not only been living there, but been living there for a little while. And once they cleared out all the mattress and all the garbage, nobody ever came back, but they never found anybody, but there was plenty of evidence that somebody was living up in the stairwell. During the first performance, one of the first performances was Ringling Brothers Circus at Assembly Hall, and I know that the upper reaches of the balcony, people were packed in the place because they wanted to see the new building, and they were looking down on the high wire act because of how high that balcony goes, and everybody said that they felt like they were kind of in a blimp watching the show instead of actually being there because they were looking down on the high wire act. I came here as a student in 93. I graduated in 97 and then came back in 2005. I was working as a writer and editor of Inside Indiana magazine, and I decided to put together a series of stories on the the athletic facilities throughout the years. And at first it was going to be just one story, but then it quickly became clear it needed to be a series of stories, and it ended up being a 13 or 14 part series. The one on Assembly Hall was 21,000 words, and it had to deal with the construction and everything that went into it. And so that's how I came to it. And then I just really got into the in-depth research, and I just think it's fascinating everything that's gone on with the naming of the place, with the controversy in the late 60s about how they were going to pay for it. And it really is a fascinating subject to me, to the point that it almost becomes an obsession to know everything I can about these buildings. And it just is in my blood, and it's something that it's a weird thing to be really excited about facilities, but that's the kind of person I am, I guess. Both assembly halls, both memorial stadiums, everything going back to the original gymnasium in 1893, which was built on the road between Owen Hall and the Union. That's where it was, and that's where the basketball program held its first practices. Things like No, when Pooch Harrell, the athletic director, wanted to move all the athletic facilities to what he was calling the North Athletic Complex, he packaged together uh, all the bids for the construction, and it ended up being way more expensive than what they expected. And so they built this temporary structure that ended up lasting as their home for 10 years because they just didn't have the money and the clearance to build the new assembly hall. But it's something that continued to be a priority even through a change of university presidents, even as the 1960s and everything kind of cranked up with the Vietnam War and everything. This was still a priority, and Assembly Hall ended up being built despite the fact that a lot of students didn't want it built, including the student body president, Guy Loftman, who is actually still a Bloomington lawyer. He really, really rallied against Assembly Hall, and there were protests and everything involved with that, but they ended up pushing it through, and it ended up being a huge positive for the community because they could host things like not only commencement and Boy Scout events, but also rock concerts. And Bob Dylan played here, the Rolling Stones played here, Elvis Presley played one of his last concerts at Assembly Hall. They've hosted the Dalai Lama and Barack Obama and a number of dignitaries, and that's something that it was really important to the campus because they didn't have an area or a venue that big that they could really host things like that. The biggest issues with financing Assembly Hall and what Loftman and the students had a problem with was the use of student fees to pay for the financing of the building. They felt that it should go towards academic pursuits and faculty salaries, and there were signs during the protest that said books before bleachers and things of that nature, and that was their biggest complaint with it. Now, Indiana's argument was that the student fees, always a percentage of it went into a slush fund that was specifically for non-academic things, so that money couldn't be used to improve faculty salaries, and faculty hiring had continued throughout that whole stretch, so it wasn't a lack of salaries that was holding anything back. That money had been earmarked for athletic or non-academic reasons, and that's where that money was supposed to come from. But that was the biggest issue from the student body on whether or not their student fees should be used for something that wouldn't help the entire campus. A number of the students also wanted it built. So there were people on either side, and I do know that the student athletic board, I believe, was for. Obviously, the student athletic board was for the construction of it, but it really was. It was the 60s, so you're going to have people protesting on both sides. And to their credit, they gave both sides of the students an opportunity to talk. And this thing, no matter what kind of fight was being put up by the students, this was going to get built because it was something that the university truly needed. The original idea for the building is very similar to what it became. I mean, it was they had a number of different designs. There were some of the designs were more round, which is what they were doing at Michigan and Illinois, and this would have been an eight-sided facility to improve sight lines. But Pooch Harrell really liked the idea of there being one theater with two areas of seatings on either side, because he felt that seating in the end zones of a basketball court were the worst ones, so he wanted to limit that. And somebody came up with the idea of we should take a look at the design of the North Carolina State Cattle Auction House, which is now called Dorton Arena, and it still exists. And it was there that the roof was unique because it allowed for wide open spaces without poles that would impact sight lines, and it also made it so that it didn't have to be a solid roof, which with the temperature and the environment in Bloomington made it so that cracks were less likely. And so the design is two parabolic arcs set at 45-degree angles to one another, and then there are wire cables that hold up concrete slabs for the roof. It allows movement of the roof, and it also makes it less expensive, and also makes it so that it can't crack like other roofs can if they're completely concrete. So that was something that really was a focus, because they liked the design. Even though it was a cattle auction house, they liked the design, and in fact, they used that same design and that same design idea to build Memorial Stadium as well. On it likely was an issue of maintenance, and it's not something that you would really think about. But there's no question that the stresses over time of the roof, whether it be heavy snow on it, would push on, it would create physical forces that could break a rusted bolt. But to a certain extent, I mean, I'm not an engineer, but I believe that the design may have led to that. But also, as long as you keep maintenance on those kind of things, it can be avoided, and that's something that certainly became a highlight during the recent renovations, is just making sure that everything was checked and everything was as safe as possible. No, it was the Ferris family farm. It was a family of grocers and meat packers, essentially, that had a farm out in that area. And in 1956, Indiana bought that land from the Ferris family and decided to move their athletic complex there because it was close enough to campus so that people could get to it, but it also provided ample parking for fans, which had been an issue when all the facilities were in the middle of campus. Parking was a real problem. Once they moved out past 17th Street, now you had wide open spaces, and they could really avoid some of the issues that they had at the original Memorial Stadium and at the field house, and just in terms of parking. Well, the overall plan was to build an assembly hall, a new field house, and a football stadium. And so that spot and why they were so far apart is because they left room for assembly hall to be there. And so that is why that spot was left. And they always planned on it. They hoped it would get done. And eventually it was going to get done one way or the other. It just took some time for them to overcome some of the financial hurdles and some of the bureaucratic hurdles that they had to deal with. But that spot was left open always for assembly hall to be there. They're absolutely. They're going to that. That has been a plan for a long time, and Fred Glass, the athletic director, has recently included that in plans to enclose the south end of Memorial Stadium, and build some new facilities for volleyball, for wrestling. It's been a long time plan of his to bring them on campus in a way that they haven't been, and that's something that's part of future plans for that whole complex. There, Fred had told me that it would be added to the east end of Gladstein Fieldhouse initially, but that plan has been scrapped, and I'm not sure exactly where they're planning on putting the new gymnasium, but I know the south end zone is going to be enclosed and maybe have some wrestling rooms and things of that nature. Well, it ended up they initially thought that they could build Assembly Hall for about 10 to 12 million dollars, and they asked for a $9 million bond issuance. And over time, interest rates fluctuated, construction costs went up, delays created issues, and it's interesting. When the original budget was put forward, the student body and Guy Loftman looked at that number and said, "You guys might say it's 10 or 12 million, but it could end up being as much as 25 million once you add in interest and all that over time." And when all was said and done, the final cost of Assembly Hall, when the bonds were finally retired, I believe in 1999, was about $26 million, is what it cost for the construction of that. Although the actual budget of the place, and in terms of real money being laid out for the actual construction costs, ran roughly $14 million, which it is a lot of money. But looking back, it doesn't seem like a lot of money because now people pay as much as $750 million for new arenas. Well, some of the initial plans and thoughts was that Assembly Hall would hold as many as 25,000 people, and yet as the designs went through, they saw that it wasn't really feasible. That number of 17,000 would have been double what could be put into the new field house, which is now Gladstein Field House. It was 9,000 was roughly what was available at the old IU Field House, which is now the Wildermuth Center. So even though it was only 17,000, it was also one of the largest in the Big Ten and in the country when it opened. And it was still a really high number of fans compared to what Indiana had at its disposal previously. And so that's why they were excited to have that much room. And if you think about it, it's nearly double the amount of people. And it really was a huge step forward for IU athletics in terms of just allowing fans to get to games. You had 9,000 people that could fit into the new field house, and that's 23,000 students on campus at the time, and that doesn't include general public that wants to come to games. So that's why coming to Assembly Hall and having such a big area was seen as such a positive for the university. Well, once it was built, everybody really got on board with it. They saw how beautiful a facility it was. You know, the gleaming white exterior really makes an impact visually, and then when you would go inside, it would be so different than anything that they previously had on campus. And although people complained about how high the balconies were and the sight lines, they also were still pretty close to the action, and so really quickly it became something that was really embraced by the community. And the community, although there was it wasn't an official name, but they called it the multi-use facility, which was kind of used to placate people who said they didn't want to just do it for academics. Herman B. Wells had started calling it Assembly Hall long before it had any kind of official name. And in fact, early on, there really wasn't an official naming that this will be called the Assembly Hall. That's what everybody just kind of started calling it. And from there, it just took on a life of its own, and it just is now just Assembly Hall. In the mid-2000s, the Board of Trustees looked at the master plan and said that it might not be financially reasonable to renovate Assembly Hall, and that no new money should be earmarked for improvements for it going forward. They wanted it replaced. Attitudes on that obviously changed, especially with the recession that we went through, and so the idea was, okay, we'll renovate it, and a couple of different plans were put forward on how much it would cost, anywhere from $40 million to I think about $123 million. And so it became clear that renovating Assembly Hall was going to be the best way to go, because fans also love the place now. It's really a mecca for college basketball, and so renovating it and trying to update it without destroying the general spirit of the place was one of the biggest keys. And although there's a lot of different things such as luxury seating that people looked at, or a lot of the other bells and whistles, bottom line is Assembly Hall needed updating because of things like HVAC equipment, electrical equipment. When that building was designed, it was not designed with computerized scoreboards and all the technical stuff that we have in modern times. It was nowhere on the radar, and so just improving those areas where ultimately was the biggest driver behind the renovation of Assembly Hall, and that's where the move had to be made, because Indiana was really falling behind in terms of technical aspects, and then just heating, air conditioning, all of that. Anytime anything would break down, it was a real problem getting parts for it. So there needed to be a serious renovation of the facility. I think it's beautiful. I think that they really did a nice job of keeping the spirit of the place and bringing it into the 21st century. There's a lot of just improvements from such simple things as railings going down in between the very steep aisles. Just having those railings is a big improvement. It's something that didn't exist in the past 10 years. It is something that it makes the place much more fan friendly. It looks far more beautiful than it did before, and it's just a great way to extend the life of a building that a lot of people have fallen in love with. Well, the Woodlawn Corridor really makes it a lot easier for people to get across campus without having to go to the perimeters of campus to get to that athletic complex, and that's something that is just going to make it a lot easier for fans because they're not bottlenecked quite as badly as they were before. And just walking to the facility, you have wide open spaces with ample lighting, and it really creates an area for people to walk and feel safe. And also just the visual of coming down that road and seeing Assembly Hall, especially at night, lit up with the glimmering white. It really makes a visual impact. And then just the way the windows kind of spell out Indiana as you look inside the building, it just makes it so much more of a iconic view, especially as you come down that Woodlawn Corridor. So some of the initial designs of Assembly Hall included an ice rink, and Bill Orwig, who was a Michigan native and an ice hockey fan, really wanted to be able to play hockey in Assembly Hall and also hold ice shows and things of that nature. And the idea was that you could have an ice rink down and then kind of roll in a basketball floor over it, or a floor over it, that would allow them to both play hockey in Assembly Hall and use it as an event center. Cost ended up being the reason why they cut that out of the mix, but that was initially one of the big pushes and a dream of Bill Orwig's when he got involved with it. I really feel Knight had very little to do with the design of the facility, because he came to Indiana after these things were really baked into the design. So Knight might not have wanted to have an ice rink, but that decision ultimately wouldn't have been his, because he wasn't here to make that decision. The 1984 Olympic trials, the U.S. team was coached by Bob Knight, and he wanted to be in a comfortable surrounding. So such players like Patrick Ewing and Michael Jordan and Charles Barkley were in town to try out for the U.S. Olympic team. And Knight actually cut Charles Barkley famously from the team, but it really made for an interesting summer in Bloomington, because you had the best basketball players in the world all gathered in Bloomington, and Assembly Hall was their playground as they prepared to take on a Russian team that ultimately ended up not coming to the Olympics that year. But Knight was very focused on putting together the best possible team to beat the Russians, and you had a number of Hall of Famers, and interestingly, Steve Alford on that team, because Knight trusted Alford, and he was really impressed with the hard work that everybody put in, and it ended up resulting in a gold medal in Los Angeles. I don't know if Bird ever played on the court. I know that he was on campus for only a very brief time. I want to say just a handful of weeks. Now, if he ever made his way over to Assembly Hall to play, I'm not sure. But certainly, Bird was on campus for a brief time. I just don't know if he ever actually played. Some of the most famous games at Assembly Hall include Bob Knight throwing the chair against Purdue in the mid '80s, and that's something that gets played on any loop whenever anything is shown about Coach Knight. The same with the game, an exhibition game against the Soviet Union, in which Knight was accused of pulling his team off the court at the end of that exhibition and causing somewhat of a little international incident, even though Knight was falsely accused of pulling his team off the floor. The game had already been forfeited, and he didn't actually refuse to play. The game had already been called. But then you throw in Kirk Haston beating Michigan State at the buzzer in 2000 or 2001 on a three-pointer, and of course the famous IU Kentucky game in 2011, which Christian Watford hit a shot at the buzzer to beat number one Kentucky. And that resulted in the most unbelievable floor rush from the fans that I've ever seen. It seemed like every fan in the building managed to make their way onto the floor, and that is something that will be appearing in IU basketball highlights for the rest of time. That was a game in which just the atmosphere of the place was like nothing I've ever been involved in, and it just showed the power and spirit and the energy that could be in Assembly Hall when the conditions are just right. I think Assembly Hall means different things to different people. There are people who would love to have seen Assembly Hall torn down and rebuilt with something a lot more modern. More traditionalists love the place because of the fact that there is so much history there, and it is so unique. Once you turn on a television, your television, and you see just seconds from the game, you know exactly where it's being played, because no other building in the country looks like Assembly Hall does. So I think the feeling is one of a lot of warm memories. I mean, Cindy Simon Scott talks about who donated money to really help the renovations along, and that's why it's Simon Scott Hall. She talks about the memories of coming to games with her dad, and just how the feeling of the place, the warmth of the place, really impacts with her years and decades later. And I think that a lot of people feel that same way about it. And it's interesting because it was a controversial building to start with, but now it's considered just the height of Indiana tradition, and some place that people really, really love to just bring up and think about in their memories.